It all began on what should have been a completely ordinary Saturday morning, the kind of day that starts with no particular drama and ends with errands checked off the list and maybe an afternoon nap. But as I've learned the hard way, life has a funny way of turning even the most routine stops into something bizarre when you live under the gaze of our neighborhood's self proclaimed sheriff, better known as the HOA Karen, a woman whose only true hobby in life seemed to be manufacturing conflict out of thin air and ensuring everyone within a 3 mile radius knew she had an opinion on everything from the color of our welcome mats to the angle at which we parked our cars. So naturally, when my wife decided to take the SUV to the gas station just down the road to fill up before our weekly trip to Costco, she had no idea that she was about to become the latest star in one of Karen's melodramatic productions, because who, in their right mind, imagines that stopping for gas could be interpreted as anything more than, well, stopping for gas? Yet, as fate would have it, Karen was lurking nearby, allegedly filling up her own car, though my suspicion is she drove out of her way just to monitor what other people were doing, and the sight of my wife calmly swiping her card at the pump and beginning to fill up was apparently too much for her to process without blowing the situation wildly out of proportion for reasons that to this day remain somewhere between comical and infuriating. To set the stage properly, you need to understand a little about this woman. Karen is the sort who prints out copies of the HOA bylaws, highlights random sentences out of context, and then waves them around like legal scripture whenever she wants to prove a point, usually about something petty like decorative gnomes are not permitted on lawns taller than 12 inches, or garbage bins must not be visible from the street on non-collection days. She thrives on the smallest imagined infraction, and if she can't find one, she'll invent one, which makes living near her feel less like a neighborhood and more like starring in a reality show where the producer is obsessed with catching you doing something scandalous, even if all you're doing is breathing too loudly. So you can imagine the pressure cooker environment she creates and how that personality collides with something as mundane as a gas pump. Now, my wife, unlike me, has the patience of a saint, and she tends to give people like Karen the benefit of the doubt, assuming maybe they're just having a rough day or need a little compassion. But even her patience was about to be tested, because while she stood there at the pump phone in one hand, receipt fluttering in the other, and the nozzle securely in the tank, she suddenly heard the unmistakable voice of Karen screeching from 2 pumps away, accusing her of tampering with the station's equipment and stealing fuel, which was so ludicrous. My wife at first thought it was some kind of prank until she turned around and saw Karen with her phone pressed to her ear, pacing dramatically like she was narrating a hostage negotiation, spouting lines like, "Yes, officer, she's definitely doing it. She's committing fraud right in front of me," while waving her free arm in theatrical gestures that made the other customers pause mid-fill to stare in confusion. It was one of those scenes that grows more surreal by the second, because my wife, entirely bewildered, could only call out, "Ma'am, I paid for this, I have the receipt," which of course fell on deaf ears because Karen wasn't interested in resolving anything rationally. No, she was committed now, locked into the thrill of her performance, and she doubled down, raising her voice and announcing for everyone within earshot that she had caught a thief red-handed and that justice would be served today. The gas station attendant, a teenager who looked barely old enough to drive, peeked out from the cashier booth with an expression that perfectly captured the sentiment of, "I'm not paid enough to deal with this," and quietly retreated inside, leaving the stage entirely to Karen and my wife, who now stood like an unwilling extra in a play she never auditioned for. And the bizarre thing about situations like this is how quickly they escalate, because before my wife even had time to text me about the madness unfolding, Karen was loudly demanding that the police arrive immediately, and sure enough, within minutes, the flashing lights of a patrol car pulled into the station, which only further inflated Karen's sense of self-importance as she pointed dramatically at my wife and practically shouted, "That's her! That's the one stealing gas!" as though she had single-handedly brought down a crime ring. My wife, clutching her receipt and trying to maintain some shred of dignity in the face of such lunacy, could do nothing but wait as the officer stepped out, one already suppressing a smirk as though he'd been down this road with Karen before, and the other trying to keep a straight face while Karen breathlessly launched into a play-by-play of events that bore almost no resemblance to reality. And it was in that instant, as the officers approached, that my wife realized the ridiculousness of How the very piece of paper in her hand, that tiny printed receipt, was about to unravel Karen's entire crusade, and she almost wished she had some popcorn, because this was about to get entertaining in the most unexpected way. The moment the officers stepped closer, the absurd theater of the situation really began to unfold, because Karen, flushed red with the kind of righteous fury that only someone with way too much free time can muster, immediately launched into a monologue about how she had been protecting the community from a rampant wave of gas thieves, and how she had witnessed, with her own two eyes, a blatant act of pump tampering, her words tumbling out in an almost rehearsed cadence that made it sound less like a genuine police report and more like a script she had been practicing in front of her bathroom mirror, and the officers, to their credit, kept their faces relatively neutral, though my wife noticed one of them glance at the other with a subtle flicker of amusement, as if to say, "Here we go again." Meanwhile, my wife, who had been standing patiently by her vehicle with the receipt in hand like it was a golden ticket from Willy Wonka's factory, finally found her opening and held it out toward the officers, explaining calmly, "I paid for my gas, here's the receipt. It even has the pump number and timestamp printed on it." Her tone deliberately measured because she knew from experience that the fastest way to cut through the fog of ridiculousness was to stick to facts. And as she extended the slip of paper, one of the officers reached for it while the other asked Karen to pause for just a moment so they could actually examine the supposed evidence of her crime. This, of course, only fueled Karen's theatrics because she immediately began talking over them, declaring that receipts can be faked and that criminals are crafty these days, an accusation so wildly disconnected from reality that a man filling his pickup truck at the next pump actually laughed out loud and muttered, "Lady, are you serious? Loud enough for everyone to hear?" Which only enraged Karen further, as she snapped at him to mind his own business and insisted she was the only one, standing up for what was right. By this point, a small crowd of customers had begun to gather because nothing draws human curiosity like flashing police lights and a woman shrieking about fuel theft at 10 in the morning, and my wife suddenly found herself at the center of what felt like a bizarre improv show, complete with hecklers, skeptics, and two uniformed officers playing the role of reluctant referees. One of the officers, clearly deciding it was time to wrap this circus up, unfolded the receipt and read it aloud with exaggerated clarity. Pump number 4, transaction approved, 26.3 gallons, total $89.47, timestamp 10:14 a.m., debit card ending in 4723, and then held it up as though it were incontrovertible evidence presented in court, which, in a way, it was because every single detail lined up perfectly with what my wife had just done. In plain sight, and the ridiculousness of Karen's claims became undeniable. And yet, in the most Karen move imaginable, she tried to pivot, exclaiming that just because she has a receipt doesn't mean she didn't steal, a statement so illogical that even the officer who had been trying to maintain a straight face finally lost his composure and burst out laughing, doubling over slightly as he struggled to get his words out, while his partner chuckled openly and said, "Ma'am, this is a valid receipt directly tied to this pump. At this exact time, there's no theft here." The laughter proved contagious because the bystanders who had been watching the scene unfold also started laughing, some shaking their heads, others pulling out their phones to discreetly record the moment, and my wife, though initially mortified by the spectacle, couldn't help but crack a smile at the absurdity, realizing she had inadvertently become the star of a viral moment. Karen, however, did not take kindly to being laughed at, and her face twisted into a mask of indignation as she shouted that the police were failing to do their duty and that the entire system was corrupt, her voice rising to a pitch that made even the nearby seagulls scatter from the station's light poles. The officers, still trying to contain their amusement, assured my wife that she was free to go and that she had done absolutely nothing wrong, while one of them turned back to Karen and gently suggested that perhaps she go home and take a breather, which only caused her to stomp her foot like a child denied candy, insisting she would be filing a formal complaint with the chief of police and that the neighborhood deserved better protection from fraudsters. By this point, it was impossible for anyone to take her seriously, and the crowd, now openly chuckling, began to disperse, shaking their heads and muttering about how some people just don't know when to quit, while my wife, still clutching her receipt as though it were a medal of honor, thanked the officers for their time and slid back into the driver's seat of our SUV, eager to put the entire ridiculous episode behind her. As she drove off, however, she noticed in her rearview mirror that Karen was still standing at the pump, waving her arms dramatically and continuing her tirade at the officers, who looked like they were regretting every career choice that had led them to this moment. And my wife couldn't help but laugh, realizing that while the whole ordeal had been stressful, it also perfectly encapsulated the madness of living under the reign of HOA Karen, a woman who could transform a perfectly ordinary trip to the gas station into a scene worthy of a sitcom, complete with cops, an audience, and a receipt that became the punchline of the entire affair. When my wife returned home and told me the whole story, complete with dramatic hand gestures mimicking Karen's frantic pacing and her spot-on impression of the officer cracking up as he read the receipt, I nearly choked on my coffee from laughing so hard. But underneath the hilarity was the recognition that this wasn't just an isolated event. This was the culmination of years of small battles, passive-aggressive notes, and neighborhood drama orchestrated by the same woman who had somehow convinced herself that being on the HOA board gave her the power of a Supreme Court justice combined with the investigative instincts of Sherlock Holmes, though in reality she had neither authority nor common sense. And as my wife relayed the part where the entire gas station crowd started laughing in unison at Karen's meltdown, I realized that this incident was likely to spread fast because in the age of smartphones, nothing ridiculous stays contained, and sure enough, by the next morning, videos of the confrontation were circulating in our local Facebook group under titles like HOA Lady Accuses Woman of Gas Theft, Police Laugh at Receipt, and Neighborhood Karen Strikes Again, this time at the pump, complete with play-by-play commentary from people who had been there in person, and the reactions ranged from outright mockery to weary sighs from those of us who knew her too well. What made it even more surreal was that Karen herself jumped into the comment threads to defend her actions, typing in all caps that she had saved the community from fraud, and accusing everyone who laughed at her of being complicit in the decline of moral standards, which only added fuel to the fire as meme creators went to work, editing her face onto movie posters like Gas Thief Hunter or Receipt Justice, The Karen Chronicles, and within hours she had inadvertently become a local celebrity for all the wrong reasons. My wife, meanwhile, was torn between embarrassment and amusement. On one hand, she hadn't asked to be part of this circus, but on the other, she admitted there was something deeply satisfying about knowing that the same receipt Karen had tried to use as evidence of fraud was now immortalized online as the ultimate symbol of her downfall. People were even joking about printing it on t-shirts, and one clever neighbor mocked up a fake HOA notice with the headline, "All residents must retain receipts to ward off false accusations," which got more likes than anything our HOA had ever posted officially. Still, as funny as it all was, we knew Karen wouldn't take this humiliation lying down, because if there was one thing more predictable than her next complaint, it was her inability to let go of a perceived injustice, and sure enough, by Monday morning she had sent out a mass email to the entire HOA mailing list, subject line, "Community Alert Gas Station Incident," in which she attempted to reframe the whole episode as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by internet bullies, while still implying that my wife's behavior had been suspicious and that vigilance must remain our top priority. The sheer audacity of it left us both speechless for a moment, but then my wife shook her head, laughed, and said, "You know what? Let her dig her own grave. Every word she writes just makes her look worse." And she was right, because instead of rallying sympathy, Karen's email only provoked more eye-rolling from neighbors who were tired of her antics, some of whom replied all with sarcastic comments like, "Should we start frisking each other at the mailbox too?" Or "Thanks for keeping us safe from dangerous coupon clippers, Karen." The tipping point came when someone forwarded the thread to a local blogger known for chronicling absurd neighborhood disputes, and suddenly the story escaped the confines of our subdivision and landed on a popular community news site, where it was retold with just enough dramatic flair to make it sound like an episode of a sitcom, complete with still frames from the viral videos of the officers laughing. The comments section exploded, with people chiming in about their own HOA horror stories, and before long, Receipt Lady, as my wife had been affectionately nicknamed, And gas pump Karen became shorthand in our town for the eternal clash between reasonable people just trying to live their lives and self appointed enforcers who thrive on chaos. For my wife, the ordeal had transformed from a stressful confrontation into a bizarre sort of empowerment. Strangers were stopping her at the grocery store to say they had her back, that they admired how calmly she had handled the situation, and one cashier even joked, "Don't forget your receipt, or Karen might be hiding in aisle 3, which made my wife laugh so hard she nearly dropped her bag of apples. At home, however, we braced for whatever retaliation Karen might cook up, because if she had the gall to escalate something as trivial as pumping gas into a 911 call, there was no telling what she might try next, and sure enough, small annoyances began to appear. Our trash cans mysteriously tipped over, anonymous complaints about unsanctioned wind chimes filed with the HOA, and even a strongly worded note taped to our front door claiming our mailbox was half an inch too tall for compliance. It was transparent, it was petty, and it only proved what everyone already knew. Karen had nothing better to do than wage her private little wars, even if she lost every single one of them. And yet, through it all, the image of those officers laughing at the receipt became a kind of shield for us, a reminder that no matter how ridiculous her accusations became, reality and humor would always be on our side. And as my wife often said with a smirk, if she calls the cops again, I'll make sure I keep my receipt handy, maybe even laminate it this time. The weeks following the infamous gas pump incident felt like living inside a bizarre social experiment, because on the one hand, life went on as usual, grocery shopping, work deadlines, yard maintenance, and yet hovering over everything was the lingering aftertaste of Karen's meltdown, which had become such a local legend that it was almost impossible to go anywhere in town without overhearing someone joking about keeping your receipt handy or whispering, "That's the lady from a gas station," whenever they recognized my wife, and while she at first blushed with embarrassment at the attention, she quickly realized that the story had turned into something bigger than just her. It had become a sort of folk tale about standing up to nonsense, a living reminder that reason and laughter could outshine paranoia and petty tyranny. In fact, what started as a humiliating confrontation had blossomed into a kind of neighborhood solidarity with people who had previously kept to themselves now bonding over shared exasperation at Karen's antics, inviting us to barbecues and HOA meetings with a wink, as if to say, "We're all in this together." Karen, of course, refused to let the matter die, and in her typical fashion, she doubled down, first by drafting a 30-page community safety proposal that outlined new rules for monitoring suspicious behavior at gas stations, grocery stores, and other local establishments, complete with diagrams that looked like they'd been drawn in Microsoft Paint, and then by attempting to pass a motion at the next HOA board meeting requiring residents to submit monthly proof of payment for utilities, fuel, and groceries to ensure accountability. The proposal was so outrageous that even her few allies on the board couldn't keep a straight face, and when my wife stood up during the meeting, cool as ever, and waved her now infamous receipt in the air, the entire room erupted in laughter, leaving Karen sputtering that everyone was undermining the seriousness of the issue while the board unanimously voted her proposal down. That should have been the end of it, but Karen's ego wouldn't allow her to retreat gracefully. She began filing complaints with local officials, writing letters to the editor of the town paper, and even showing up at city council meetings to rail against systemic gas theft, a crusade that only served to make her more of a punchline, especially after one councilman quipped, "Maybe we should appoint you head of the Department of Receipts," which drew roars of laughter and cemented her reputation as the town's resident busybody. Meanwhile, my wife leaned into the humor of it all, jokingly carrying extra copies of receipts in her purse, and even framing the original gas station slip to hang in our entryway, a tongue-in-cheek trophy commemorating the day absurdity turned into victory. The framed receipt became a conversation starter whenever guests came over, and before long, it symbolized not just one ridiculous incident, but the resilience of refusing to be cowed by unnecessary drama. Ironically, the more Karen tried to reclaim her dignity by pushing her narrative, the more isolated she became, because neighbors who once tolerated her now openly avoided her, crossing the street to escape her rants or rolling their eyes whenever she marched through the neighborhood with her clipboard, searching for violations that nobody cared about anymore. What had once been fear The fear of receiving one of her nasty grams or being called out at a meeting was replaced with collective amusement, and that shift in power dynamics was palpable. People stopped tiptoeing around her and started mocking her behind her back, some even to her face, with one brave neighbor wearing a t-shirt to the community pool that read, "Ask me about my receipt," while another placed a giant cardboard cutout of a gas pump on their lawn for Halloween with a sign that read, "Beware of Karen." At first, my wife worried that all of this attention might spiral into something uglier, that Karen's bitterness might escalate beyond petty notes and obnoxious speeches, but over time it became clear that her power came not from genuine authority, but from people's willingness to take her seriously, and once that spell was broken, she was just another loud voice shouting into the void. Eventually, even the local police got in on the joke, with one officer jokingly waving at my wife when he saw her at the supermarket and calling out, "Got your receipt today?" A gesture that made her laugh and reassured her that the people who mattered most understood the absurdity of it all. And so, what began as a stressful Saturday morning turned into a turning point for our neighborhood, a moment that exposed the ridiculousness of Karen's self-appointed crusades and reminded everyone that life is too short to bow to manufactured drama. Instead, it's meant to be laughed at, shared, and turned into a story you tell over and over again, each retelling sweeter than the last. As for Karen, she never stopped being Karen, but her bark lost its bite, and in the grand tally of neighborhood folklore, she would forever be remembered not as the enforcer she fancied herself, but as the woman who called 911 on a perfectly innocent gas station stop and got laughed out of her own performance by a piece of paper no bigger than a bookmark. And for us, the moral was simple: keep your cool, keep your humor, and above all, keep your receipts, because sometimes the tiniest slip of paper can expose the biggest fool in the room.